All right, so remember in this lecture, we're talking about what creates and maintains species diversity. Well, obviously, evolution can create new species through speciation, right? So, in particular, I want to draw your attention to this idea of an adaptive radiation. It's the rapid evolution of a single species into many new species. It's very common on islands. So, I think I've said before, people don't tend to make very good plant pictures. But they make these beautiful drawings of animals. So these are Darwin's finches that live on the Galapagos Islands. It's not all of them, but it's a subset of them. And what you had was some ancestral ground-eating, seed-eating finch is what we think got blown out to the island through a process similar to island biogeography. And once it was there, it really rapidly, within tens of thousands of years, radiated into a large number of different species that have extremely different niches, right? They eat different food, and they have different traits that allow them to eat their different food. So these probing bills allow for cactus and insect eating. These sort of heavy bills allow for sort of crushing of seeds or fruits. And these plants, or these birds, had this adaptive radiation that went from one species to very many through the process of evolution. There are plenty of examples of plants, but like I say, people don't make pretty pictures. So this is one from your textbook. It talks about the evolution of silver swords on the Hawaiian archipelago. And so the thought is that they got to Kauai and made their way to all the other islands with speciation along the way. So you can see here's 3 different species of silver swords from your textbook. That look wildly different. Again, very different traits. If we put these in Sandra Diaz's trait ordination, these would be in very different places because they're very different growth forms. All right, so far we've been discussing communities and biodiversity at relatively local scales, right? The scale of an individual field, the individual forest or island, or if you think of the labs that we've done the last couple weeks, at the scale of quadrat, that's some arbitrary size. But we know that diversity scales with the size of the area we look at. So I just wanted to show you this picture of global diversity as an estimate of the diversity of species across the world. And what we see, or maybe what you can see, is a few patterns. If we were in the room together, I would ask you to, tell me what you think you see here. But in general, what people notice is that there are more species near the equator than there are far from the equator, with a few really obvious exceptions to the rule, like the Sahara Desert and the badlands on the interior of Australia. But in places that have enough moisture, you tend to have high species diversity close to the equator and low species diversity far from the equator. In fact, we could quantify this with a relatively simple graph, right? In general, there are more species close to the equator and fewer as you move towards the poles, right? So, the latitude goes in this way, sort of the absolute latitude. So as you go towards Antarctica or the Canadian Arctic, you get the same thing. And so people have often asked, well, why are there more species in the tropics? And that's what I want to think about for the rest of this lecture. So there are a lot of hypotheses out there. These aren't mutually exclusive, which means all of these could be true in part or in whole, right? So a mutually exclusive hypothesis would be something that they both can't be true. These are useful in science, right? My hypothesis is that this is bigger or smaller, then those are mutually exclusive. Something can't be both big and small at the same time. But these are hypotheses that can be true at the same time. And there's more than these. Again, this is a freshman class, so here's 3 that I want you to think about. And they are age of the community, the benignness of the environment, and energy input. So let's think about the age of the community, right? So particularly in the recent Holocene, right? The Earth most of the northern hemisphere was covered by glacier. So this is 18,000 years before present. You can see that where we are in Indiana, or where Purdue is in Indiana, would have been under kilometers of ice, right? So until recently, there were glaciers on top of Indiana, right? And so you could imagine that 2 different processes over 18,000 years, which was enough time to generate all of those different finches on the Galapagos, the 2 processes, right? The ecological succession as the glaciers receded and these species colonized the newly scoured Earth. And at the same time, there might have been adaptive radiations. And so as you go north, in particular, but the southern hemisphere was also glaciated, so you can imagine ice coming in from the 2 poles. that communities close to the equator are just older. They were never destroyed by glaciers, or at least not since the Ordovician or so. And so it might just be that if we gave enough time to the north, that succession would take its course and you would get a bunch of radiations like the silver swords and the Darwin's finches, and the diversity would equalize if we could stop glaciating. And maybe climate change will do that experiment for us. So that's the idea of the age of the communities. And yeah, most of the tropics have never been glaciated. And so those communities are much, much older. And so they might be closer to some kind of ecological and evolutionary equilibrium. Related to that is the idea that the tropics are a relatively benign environment, right? So most of the tropics are very warm, they're very moist, which is pretty good for most life. If you compare that to Indiana or the Arctic tundra or Antarctica, right, it just might be the case that it's just easier to be alive in the tropics, that the adaptations that are necessary to survive an Indiana winter causes some limiting similarity that reduces the number of species, right? So yeah, if we look at the tropics, very wet, very warm, do you get those anomalies like these sort of hot, dry deserts in the Sahara and in the interior of Australia, and they're just not benign places to live. So that pattern of diversity where we see, lower diversity in the Sahara and in Australia, even though they're relatively close to the equator, might be support for this type of an hypothesis. The third idea that I wanted you to think about was the fact that there might be just higher energy input, right? So if you think of the angle that the sun's rays are hitting the Earth, you have a really low angle of light hitting in the Arctic. And I can tell you, having done work in northern Canada, that you can't, the energy of the sun just doesn't feel as warm when it's coming at you from this really low angle as it does when you're down at the equator. So what that means is that like more of this energy gets dissipated through the atmosphere and it doesn't hit as much here. So there may just not be enough energy input. Right? So maybe more energy means more organisms, which increases the chance of population persistence, increases the probability that there'll be a mutation that leads to speciation. Think of the trophic pyramids that I showed you. It could just be that the pyramids are fatter at the equator than they are at the north, which increases the rate of both of these things. So this isn't exhaustive. This isn't an exhaustive sort of list of the mechanisms that can maintain diversity, but I think for an introductory ecology class, this is a good set. So for review, you should know the 8 mechanisms that relate to coexistence and biodiversity ecologically that we talked about. I'm not going to say them again, but here's the list of the ones that we talked about. You should know the difference between stabilizing and equalizing mechanisms of coexistence and be able to explain why they're both important. Should know a little bit about how evolution can create diversity, and in particular know about the definition of an adaptive radiation, and maybe know the 3 explanations that I gave you for why there are more species at the equator than there are at the pole. And for fun, you could try to think about other ideas beyond those 3, but that's not necessary for the class.